for coming and welcome to the Humanities. I'm Salvador, Director of the Institute as of this year. And before I introduce our second faculty fellow lecture of the year, that I'm really excited about this talk. I do want to thank the Institute staff, our student workers, our grad student workers, Courtney Beck, Craig Raymond, Dean Dibbler, and our undergraduate work right back there, Linda DeMett. I especially want to thank Katie Corboy, who takes care of pretty much everything around here, including the catering and she wears 10,000 hats. And she's absolutely wonderful. So thank you, Katie. I want to just point to a couple of upcoming events. So next Tuesday, October 17th, we have an event that we're co-hosting with the cultural arm of the French Consulate called Endured in Chosen Communities. It'll be Tuesday afternoon from about 1:45 till 6 p.m. at Hull House. You can find information. Let me know if you'd like more information on that, but you can register online, there's still spots. The week after that, we're on October 24th, so exactly a week after that, Keenan Malik will be here in conversation with Kenneth Warren from the University of Chicago and David Stovall of UIC, and that'll be introduced and moderated by Walter Van Michaels. That'll be here on October 24th at 4 p.m. November 7th, we have a day-long symposium on child migration across the Americas with a keynote by Arena Grande. That'll be November 7th, all day from 9 to 5, I believe, right here at the Institute. November 15th, we're hosting a symposium that's sponsored by and hosted by the University of Illinois Press. There'll be a variety of panels from how to write your book when you don't have time to write a book, all the way to I'm excited about that panel, actually. I can't wait to find out. All the way to publishing as a possibility, as a career possibility for people with PhDs. So that information will be coming out soon. There will also be lunch provided with registration. That's just an overview of major events. Our working groups are absolutely incredible. We have wonderful events coming up. You can take the flyers or just pay attention to our emails. There's a really exciting event on October 30th, co-sponsored by the South Asia Reading Group and the Queer and Trans Studies Working Group that looks fantastic. We also co-sponsor events, as you know. So just a steady stream of wonderful events. And it's really all thanks to you and the wonderful things that are proposed to us. And it's a huge pleasure today to introduce Joaquín Chávez, who's Associate Professor in the Department of History here at UIC. This is his second Institute for the Humanities Fellowship. He was a fellow in 2014-15, and that was for his book project that resulted in the book Poets and Prophets of Resistance, Intellectuals and the Origins of El Salvador's Civil War, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2017. He's also held a research fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation to conduct research and writing at the Latin America Institute at the Freie University of Berlin. In addition to his work has been published widely in a variety of books and journals, including the American Historical Review and Peace and Conflict, the Journal of Peace Psychology. He's also published widely in more public-facing venues, such as the NACLA Report on the Americas, as well as in edited volumes published in the United States and also in El Salvador. And he's made numerous media appearances as well. And the other thing to know about Joaquín Chávez, he's a practitioner of his scholarship and very much a public intellectual. He's been very involved in peace and conflict resolution processes around the world, including in El Salvador. Also consulting with peace processes in Nepal. And I should note that he also co-founded with Andreas Selden the Imagining Peace in the 21st Century Working Group here at the Institute, which was operating from 2016 to 2020. As an expert on peace negotiations, conflict resolution, and the transition to democracy, he served as a consultant on peace negotiations at Berghoff Conflict Research in Berlin, as well as the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva, the Center for Conflict Resolution of the U.S. Social Research Council, United Nations Development Program, and in El Salvador, the Peace Center, the Fundación Nacional para el Desarrollo, and the National Security Council on Public Security. And his work, again, focuses on conflict resolution and peace as a process that requires courage, creativity, imagination, and openness to transformation. And his new project builds on the history of the Civil War in El Salvador to contribute to a new understanding of the end of the Cold War in Latin America, as well as the aftermath of the Cold War in contemporary societies. And so I am particularly excited to hear Joaquín Chávez, who will speak to us today about his new project with a talk entitled Avant-Garde Diplomacy and Cold War Politics in Latin America, the Joint French-Mexican Declaration on El Salvador.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ellen, for a wonderful introduction. I also want to thank Katie Carboy and all of the students and people who made this event possible. And thank every one of you for coming today to listen to the talk. On August 28, 1981, Mexico and France officially supported a negotiated solution to the Salvador Civil War, granted political recognition to the Farabundo Martin National Liberation Front, FMLN, and the Democratic Revolutionary Front, FDR, a movement formed by insurgent groups, political parties, social movements, and civil society organizations that confronted the US-backed Christian Democrat-Military Junta that ruled the country. That day, the Secretary of Foreign Relations of Mexico, Jorge Castañeda y Álvarez de la Rosa, and the Minister of Foreign Relations of France, Claude Cheysson, issued a joint declaration on El Salvador and immediately presented it to the President of the United Nations Security Council, the Foreign Minister of Panama, Jorge Joaquín. Doing so, Mexico and France tacitly questioned the basic principles of US foreign policy in El Salvador and prompted a hostile diplomatic response from 9 Latin American governments. This talk examines the significance of the joint French-Mexican Declaration in the political and diplomatic history of El Salvador Civil War and its reverberations in the history of Atlantic and Latin American diplomacy during the 1980s Cold War. Today, I offer a section of my current research on the social and intellectual history of the peace process that put an end to the Salvadoran conflict. My research examines the dynamics of war, international politics, and diplomacy that shape imaginaries of peace and democracy among actors of the Salvadoran conflict, and illustrates the centrality of El Salvador's peace process in the history of the Cold War in Latin America. In other words, I'm currently writing a history of the conflict resolution model that put an end to El Salvador Civil War. My study seeks to answer a fundamental historical question: why and how enemies of war with antagonistic ideologies who fought a protracted civil war negotiated an unprecedented peace accord that effectively concluded one of the most destructive conflicts in the modern history of Latin America and set the basis for the only lasting democratic period in Salvadorian history. The question has not lost potency in the last 30 years. It is central to write a history of a modern civil war, which showed that adversaries with deeply entrenched ideological differences paradoxically formed the critical mass of intellectuals that made peace and democracy possible in El Salvador. My research considers the largely unanswered historical question of how the Cold War ended and the multiple legacies of that global conflict for contemporary societies. Systematic human rights violations perpetrated by state agents in El Salvador between 1980 and 1981 prompted France and Mexico to issue a joint declaration. A methodologically rigorous demographic study conducted by Amelia Green and Patrick Bau in 2019 estimated that state forces and their quote-unquote informal allies, that means right-wing paramilitary groups, killed 12,404 civilians in 1980, 10,792 in 1981, and 22,904 in 1982. In other words, thousands of Salvadorians were victims of state terror during the tenure of the US-sponsored junta, between January 3rd, 1980 and May 2nd, 1982. Such state terror includes some of the most notorious mass killings in the history of Latin America, like El Mozote massacre, perpetrated by US-trained Salvadoran army units in Morazan, a department in eastern El Salvador, in December 1981. The American historian Greg Grandin claimed that the Reagan administration decision to provide military aid and training to El Salvadoran armed forces enabled what Grandin called the quote-unquote genocide option in El Salvador. As the monument to memory and truth in El Salvador reminds, everyday people, students, teachers, workers, peasants, intellectuals, men, women, and children were victims of state violence during the early years of the Civil War. The rapid escalation of the Salvadorian conflict also concerned Mexico and France. In the aftermath of the so-called quote-unquote final offensive, a series of attacks carried out by the insurgent guerrilla army against state forces across El Salvador in January 1981, international observers expected that the army's counteroffensive against the guerrilla strongholds would quickly dissipate the power of the insurgents. But as it turned out, the final offensive, quote unquote, became the first episode of a protracted civil war that devastated El Salvador between January 1981 and January 1992. Despite President Reagan's assurances that the Salvadorian conflict was a case of international terrorism sponsored by Cuba, Nicaragua, and the Soviet Union, and not a popular uprising against an illegitimate government, which would be swiftly defeated by the US-backed junta, Latin American and European governments soon realized that the civil war in El Salvador was persistent, widespread, and could seriously destabilize Central America. Between 1981 and 1983, two armies, and two distinct territories emerged in El Salvador. These are two images of the monument to memory and truth in El Salvador. Basically contain the names of approximately 25,000 people who were victims of state violence during the entire Civil War. Here's a more panoramic view of the monument. And this image basically shows the members of social movements who were, for the most part, the victims of state violence in this period. And this is an image of the one guerrilla army unit at the beginning of the war in 1981. Between 1981 and 1983, two armies, and two distinct territories emerged in El Salvador. The government and the armed forces of El Salvador remain in control of the urban centers in most of the countryside. The FMLN, an insurgent coalition created in 1980, created war fronts and exercised political authority in isolated rural areas in a number of departments in El Salvador. The FMLN also operated in urban and rural areas in the rest of the country. State forces carried out constant aerial bombardments and large-scale military operations in territories under rebel control. Rural areas of the country that amounted to roughly 15% of the territory were sites of persistent combats between the guerrilla forces and the Salvadorian army. You have an image of the representation of the early year of the war, basically showing in the dark color areas, basically areas where there was a heavy presence of the FMLN forces. International observers quickly understood that the vital question of how to establish a legitimate government capable of restoring a single sovereignty and territoriality, to conduct democratic reforms, to protect human rights, and to restructure the country's security sector in accordance with international democratic standards, could only be appropriately resolved through a political negotiation that involved the parties at war in Salvadorian society as a whole. This conundrum crucially shaped the history of El Salvador's Civil War and the 1980s Cold War in Latin America. These initiatives formulated in the start of the conflict dealt implicitly or explicitly with the restoration of the country's legitimate authority, single sovereignty, and territorial integrity. From 1980 onwards, the FMLN consistently advocated a negotiated settlement of the conflict. And in this regard, a number of people with diverse backgrounds and professions and so forth became the emissaries of the insurgents. So these emissaries, along with government officials, foreign diplomats, public intellectuals, UN mediators, and international experts, formed the critical mass that made the El Salvador peace process or peace accord possible. In this context, the joint French-Mexican Declaration became a watershed in the political and diplomatic history of the Civil War, and a landmark in Atlantic diplomacy during the Cold War. The declaration endowed the FMLN-FDR with an extraordinary international legitimacy and effectively transformed it into a counterpart in a potential peace negotiation with the Salvadoran government. Mexico and France move away from traditional legal concepts applicable to civil wars like quote-unquote state of belligerence and quote-unquote belligerent forces, and coined the new and more comprehensive category of quote-unquote representative political force, which indicated not only the existence of an insurgency that challenged state power in a given country, but also stressed its political legitimacy. The statement reasserted Mexico's diplomatic prestige in Western Europe, its autonomy vis-a-vis US foreign policy. France was and still is a strategic ally of the United States and a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Therefore, the joint French-Mexican Declaration of El Salvador carried major weight in international relations. The declaration implicitly questioned the fundamental premises of Reagan's policy in El Salvador. Mexico and France deemed the FMLN-FDR a representative political force of the Salvadorian people, and a legitimate counterpart in a peace negotiation, not a quote-unquote terrorist group, as Reagan would have. France and Mexico rejected foreign intervention in El Salvador and asked the international community to support a UN role in the solution to the Salvadorian conflict. As we shall see, the 9 Latin American countries condemned the declaration in the strongest terms, and ironically labeled it a form of French and Mexican interventionism in Latin America. The Reagan administration prompted the Latin American backlash against Mexico and France, but did not openly condemn the declaration, and instead conveyed a scheming diplomatic response to it. Lower level State Department officials claimed that Mexico and France actually shared the Reagan administration's concern about the Salvadorian conflict and advocated elections as a political solution to the Civil War. In this talk, I contend that the joint French-Mexican Declaration on El Salvador constituted avant-garde diplomacy in the context of the 1980 Cold War. The term avant-garde, quote-unquote, in this context, alludes to an innovative diplomatic initiative that offered an accurate reading of the characteristics of the Salvadorian conflict and formulated an unconventional but feasible alternative to stop the systematic human rights violations perpetrated overwhelmingly by state forces, and to find a political solution to a devastating war that was on the verge of becoming a regional conflict. The declaration prevented the further escalation of the Central American conflicts and created the conceptual basis of the conflict resolution model that put an end to El Salvador's civil war. Such model became a paradigm to resolve internal armed conflicts in various regional settings in the subsequent 2 decades. Places like Guatemala, Nepal, Colombia, etc. In contrast, the Latin American countries that blasted the declaration entirely misrepresented its nuanced diplomatic and political logic and its crucial implications for the de-escalation and humanization of the Salvadorian conflict and for regional peace and stability. Mexico and France recognized the political legitimacy of the Salvadorian insurgency as a necessary step to promote peace negotiations in El Salvador. In contrast, the authoritarian anti-communist governments that ruled Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Guatemala, Honduras, and Bolivia at that time, which collectively condemned the purported French-Mexican interventionism, produced a heavy-handed statement that rejected a viable political solution to end the conflict in 1981. On the other hand, Venezuela, under President Luis Rivera Campins, a Christian Democrat leader who became the most influential critic of the joint French-Mexican Declaration, provided economic aid and political advice to the junta and simply overlooked the systematic human rights violations committed by state forces in El Salvador. The government of Colombia under President Julio César Turbay Ayala, another critic of the declaration, faced multiple insurgencies and logically rejected it to avoid setting a precedent in the Colombian conflict. In sum, the French-Mexican Declaration was a groundbreaking diplomatic initiative that established solid conceptual basis for the peace negotiations that ended the Civil War. In contrast, the Caracas Declaration, the joint statement issued by the foreign ministers of 9 Latin American countries in September 1981, constituted, in fact, a clumsy diplomatic stance on the Salvadoran conflict that echoed Reagan's Cold War policy in Latin America. In the rest of the lecture, I will ponder the content and the origins of the young French-Mexican Declaration, as well as some of its domestic and international reverberations. In particular, I will examine facets of the activist diplomacy that preceded it. You have here another image of towards the end of the Civil War, and fundamentally, for now, it's important to notice how much the war had expanded in the 10-year period. So it's a dramatic expansion of the war, precisely because there was not a possibility to find a political solution in 1981, as per the French-Mexican Declaration. The French-Mexican Declaration offered several central ideas to conduct. I'll come back to this image. The French-Mexican Declaration offered 7 central ideas to conduct peace negotiations. The FMLN was a representative political force and legitimate counterpart in peace negotiations. Second, a global political solution with the participation of the Salvadoran society as a whole is the fundamental paradigm. Part of the result of the negotiation would be the creation of a quote-unquote new political regime. That is to say, there would be a substantial political reform of the state. Fourth, part of this reform will be the restructuration of the armed forces of El Salvador. 5, respect of popular will expressed through authentically free elections and other mechanisms proper for a democratic system was a key component of the model. 6, the protection of the civilian population according to the applicable international norms, particularly in the framework of the United Nations. Basically, protection of human rights. And 7, the international community will facilitate the understanding between the representatives of the Salvadoran political forces in conflict to establish concord in the country and to avoid all foreign intervention in the internal affairs of El Salvador. So towards the end of the talk, I'll probably come back to some of these fundamental ideas, basically to show that these ideas provide the fundamental framework for the peace negotiations, the UN-mediated peace negotiations in basically between 1990 and 1992. Each of the previous points overtly contradicted Reagan's foreign policy in El Salvador. As previously stated, the Reagan administration considered the FMLN FDR not a representative political force of the Salvadoran people, but a terrorist group, quote unquote, and explicitly rejected the participation of the FMLN in the political solution to the conflict, rejected dialogue and negotiations between the insurgency and the Salvadorian government, objected the participation of the United Nations in the political solution of the Civil War, claimed that there were conditions to carry out free and fair elections that express popular will in El Salvador, maintained that the Salvadoran armed forces required advice but not restructuration, and that the United States did not intervene in the internal affairs of El Salvador. Discrepancies among allies. Weighing how Mexico and France produced a declaration that ran counter to the mere premises of Reagan's Cold War policy in Central America. So explicit considerations that were motivated the declaration were the following: the suffering of the Salvadorian people, the growing risks for peace and stability in Central America, the risk of internationalization of the conflict, the extreme seriousness of the situation in El Salvador, the need to implement fundamental political, social, and economic transformations in El Salvador, and lastly, the need to reestablish concord. In short, the principles of the UN Charter and the responsibility as members of the international community inspired Mexico and France to issue the declaration. Both Mexico and France were willing to conduct independent diplomatic initiatives for very particular reasons. Mexico's foreign policy in Central America sought to prevent the intensification of the conflicts in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala, to avoid the massive influx of war refugees and the stabilization of Mexico's southern border. On the other hand, the historical and cultural links between Mexico and Central America and Mexico's diplomatic history in the region also were important precedents for Mexico's diplomacy in Central America. Mexico under President José López Portillo, 1976-1982, backed politically and diplomatically the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, in revolutionary movements in El Salvador and in Guatemala. Such role apparently gave Mexico certain leverage in its bilateral negotiations with the United States. Mexico fleeting oil boom apparently also steered President López Portillo independent foreign policy in Central America between 1978 and 1982. In this logic, the foreign minister of the Secretary of Foreign Relations, Castañeda, promoted bilateral talks between the Reagan administration and Cuba, the Sandinistas and the FMLN FDR respectively. Castañeda's diplomatic initiatives on the Central American crisis clearly boosted Mexico's international reputation as a promoter of peace in Latin America. Since the start of the Civil War, Mexico viewed the FMLN FDR as a bona fide revolutionary movement, and in turn the Salvadoran insurgents deemed Mexico a crucial political and diplomatic ally. This is not surprising. The Mexican government, the Revolutionary Institutional Party, the PRI, the official party, opposition parties, media outlets, cultural institutions, universities, public intellectuals clearly understood the historical roots of the Salvadoran conflict and considered the FMLN FDR a legitimate political force. In September 1981, Xavier Campos Ponce, Mexican journalist, wrote a memo to Mexico's Secretary of Foreign Relations that illustrates this point. Campos Ponce maintained that deeply ingrained historical, cultural, ethical, and even emotional factors drove Mexico's foreign policy in El Salvador. Campos wrote, and now let's not be surprised that Mexico had shown his sympathy and recognition to the Salvadorian people who suffered the internationalization of his domestic problems and is being destroyed by other generals, trained and paid in the United States, US military academies. Our sympathy must be greater if we remember that Salvadorians are very close to the Mexican heart because of the Toltec speech preserved there. And from there results in us, Mexicans, their plight of moral and fraternal help. Moreover, since in a year and a half, more than 20,000 men, women, and children have been assassinated with the supply of US weapons that Mexico does not pretend and cannot impede, like our foreign minister, Jorge Castañeda, explained. Let's not be surprised then that Mexico, supported by the libertarian France that is now being resuscitated by the French socialists, have given their recognition to this popular organization from El Salvador, that people that fights for his freedom and for justice. Mexico is in his place. México está en su puesto. Under these circumstances, the Mexican government authorized the FMLN FDR to establish a political, diplomatic, and media center in Mexico City that operated throughout the Civil War. Jorge Castañeda Goodman, Mexican scholar and former Secretary of Foreign Relations, played a key unofficial role in Mexico's diplomacy during the tenure of his father, Jorge Castañeda y Álvarez de la Rosa, as Mexico's Secretary of Foreign Relations from April 79 to November 1982, wrote that the Salvadoran revolutionaries deemed Mexico's endorsement crucial to gain international legitimacy. The FMLN was a quote-unquote democratic, peaceful, and independent opposition, quote-unquote, that was forced to take up arms, quote-unquote, to seek the solidarity of the socialist bloc and to use certain military methods due to the quote-unquote army's repression. The best assurance of their quote-unquote non-alignment rested in their eyes with reason in the Mexican sponsorship, wrote Castañeda Woodman. The Secretary of Foreign Relations, Castañeda, boosted the FMLN diplomatically to promote peace negotiations between the insurgency and the junta. Castañeda also hoped to encourage moderation and to reduce the Cuban influence among FMLN commanders to this policy. In the aftermath of the FMLN offensive in January 1981, which is generally considered the start of the Civil War proper, Castañeda promoted an encounter between FMLN the FMLN and the newly installed Reagan administration through Richard Allen, Reagan's national security advisor. Castañeda organized a meeting between FMLN leaders and Allen's advisors in Mexico City. However, the Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, vetoes Castañeda's initiative. Haig firmly opposed negotiations between the FMLN and the junta. Still, the Mexican diplomacy persevered on the matter. François Mitterrand, on the other hand, the president of France, shared the social democratic consensus on the Salvador Civil War. European leaders affiliated with the Socialist International, including Willy Brandt from the Federal Republic of Germany, Olof Palme from Sweden, Mitterrand from France, Bruno Kreisky from Austria, Felipe González from Spain, actively supported a political solution to the Salvadoran conflict. The Socialist International, a London-based organization made up of move a little bit to the image of the FDR President Guillermo Hugo and Olof Palme in Stockholm. The Socialist International, a London-based organization made up of socialists, social democrats, and labor parties from 39 countries, chiefly government parties from Western Europe, voiced skepticism about Reagan's policy in Central America and endorsed a political solution to the conflict as early as September 1980. Pierre Schori, the official spokesperson of Sweden Social Democratic Party, deemed the Salvadoran conflict, quote unquote, the result of generations of negligence in the social and economic fields, and the dominance of a small elite over a quote unquote practical feudal society. Schori acknowledged that Napoleon Duarte, a Christian Democrat leader, became the de facto head of the junta in December 1980, but asserted that the Salvadoran military still constituted a quote unquote real power in the country. Thus, US military aid to El Salvador was not conducive to peace, but to the prolongation of war, for it sustained a right-wing government that perpetrated systematic human rights violations. In Schori's words, quote unquote, United States military advisors and arms have been sent to a country in internal strife, quote unquote, where government condoned right-wing killings, produced more civilian victims in 1980 than, quote unquote, in all other nations of Latin America together. European social democrats rejected US policy in El Salvador and instead recognized the legitimacy of the Salvadoran insurgents. In particular, Schori supported the leadership of this person, Guillermo Hugo. Basically advocated a political solution similar to the multiple negotiations held in London that put an end to the war in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. In May 1981, the start of the Mitterrand first presidency, 1981-1988, created a new opportunity to advance the political solution to the Salvadoran conflict for Mexican diplomacy. According to the Mexican ambassador Gustavo Irruegas, President Mitterrand told the foreign minister Castañeda, who was his personal friend, that he wanted to do something as a quote unquote socialist president of an imperialist country, quote unquote, to please his left voters in France and to consolidate his credentials as a left-wing leader in Latin America. In September, Mitterrand himself explained the logic of France's policy vis-a-vis the Salvadoran conflict during the press interviews. Mexican diplomats stationed in Paris promptly faxed. That was the time of the faxes. Promptly faxed the following excerpt of Mitterrand's interview to the foreign minister Castañeda. Why do you want that French logic in foreign relations be the same as the American logic? I am no less conscious of the Soviet danger to subversion or direction, but to interpret historically the evolution of the peoples of Latin America, especially from Central America, through a simplistic East-West analysis, especially through communism and anti-communism, is absurd. It is the misery and the exploitation of those countries dominated in the political plane by implacable dictatorships what provokes those revolutions. Those revolutions seek support. And if the Western world appears like the enemy and guarantor of the oligarchies in power, they will search for weapons elsewhere. I would like to break that logic. That is France's policy. French policy considers that the Americans have a questionable and simplistic policy in Central America. quote unquote, fighting communism does not necessarily deny that the misery of the less favored social classes, if there is no alternative, favors communism. That is why I have a left policy about the support of the revolutionary movements in El Salvador. Yes, the authentic revolutionary movements. The French commitment of friendship with the United States does not imply support for all the dictatorships in the world. Activist diplomacy. The drafting of the French-Mexican Declaration. The impossibility of promoting peace negotiations in El Salvador prompted the Mexican ambassador Iruegas, an expert in the Central American crisis, to submit an oficio, quote unquote, a paper that considered the idea that Mexico granted the status of belligerent force to the FMLN, to the Secretary of Foreign Relations Castañeda. In the early 1980s, the terms, quote unquote, state of belligerency and quote unquote belligerent forces were outmoded in international relations, and diplomatic experts in France and Mexico rejected them for different reasons. In the end, Castañeda and Chaison, the foreign ministers of Mexico and France, respectively, agreed not to talk about belligerency and produced the innovative term, quote unquote, representative political force to designate the Salvadoran insurgency. Iruega's paper apparently made the drafting of a joint French-Mexican declaration thinkable for Castañeda. With his father approval, Castañeda Goodman, the son of the foreign minister, asked Regis Debray, a political advisor to President Mitterrand, to consider the joint French-Mexican declaration on El Salvador, which included, quote unquote, some sort of bilateral negotiation recognition of the FMLN. Debray subscribed the idea. Castañeda also discussed the idea with Salvador Samayoa and Guillermo Ungo, two FDR-FMLN representatives stationed in Mexico City. Castañeda, Goodman, Samayoa, and Debray, three prominent public intellectuals in their own right, were the drafters of the joint French-Mexican declaration. So Samayoa, for instance, was or is still alive, a philosopher, former professor of philosophy at the Central American University, and the former Minister of Education of El Salvador, who resigned his post as minister and joined the insurgency in 1980 as the state terror escalated dramatically in the country. He's also the co-author and signatory of the El Salvador peace process. Castañeda, Goodman, and Debray are very well-known intellectuals. The list of contributors to the French-Mexican Declaration is long and includes literary figures, diplomats, and politicians on both sides of the Atlantic. For instance, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the luminary of the Latin American boom, helped to persuade the Mitterrand government to support the declaration. In Paris, Ambassador Porfirio Muñoz Ledo, a senior Mexican diplomat, officially negotiated the terms of the declaration with the French counterpart and provided expert advice to Castañeda and Samayoa. Leaders of the FDR-FMLN who were in Paris engaged in multiple negotiations with the French government, the French Socialist Party, and the Socialist International, and also contributed to the drafting of the declaration. President Mitterrand himself, Daniel Mitterrand, France's first lady, and top leaders of the French Socialist Party were also directly involved in the drafting of the declaration. Lastly, the foreign ministers, Castañeda and Chaison, approved the final draft and handed it to the respective presidents. The drafters of the declaration carefully considered international law and foreign policy norms to shield France and Mexico from a potential backlash from the United States. The declaration emphasized the risk of internationalization of the Salvadoran conflict, the suffering of the Salvadoran people, and the responsibility of the international community to promote an humanitarian and political solution to the conflict. The official recognition of the FDR-FMLN as quote-unquote representative political force confirmed the existence of the duality of power in El Salvador at the start of the Civil War, nothing more. France and Mexico neither instigated the Salvadoran conflict nor supported the Revolutionary War, but both countries considered the political recognition of the insurgency a necessary step to achieve a negotiated solution to the conflict and to end the suffering of the Salvadoran people. I wrote a section on the media uproar, but I'm just going to show you a few headings. Basically, it was a lot of coverage all over the world because media from all over the world cover the event from multiple perspectives. There was a dominant version that basically emphasized that it was a major diplomatic victory for the Salvadoran rebels and a blow to US foreign policy. But others emphasized the Latin American reaction against the declaration, or the US reaction against the declaration. Multiple perspectives. This is the Houston Chronicle. Le Matin from Paris, basically stating that the French have recognized the two guerrilla fronts. El Universal de Caracas, basically stating pretty much the same. Right? País from Madrid, right? Stating the same. And this is Salvadorian media, basically a conservative newspaper in El Salvador. El Diario de Hoy basically stated that the Salvadoran Junta rejected the statement. And just want to call your attention to the handwriting, because it is part of the diplomatic archives of Mexico. Someone handed this copy apparently to Ambassador Porfirio Muñoz Leal with a sort of like threatening sentence, right? He's saying, Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador of Mexico, Porfirio Muñoz Leal, I beg you not to interfere in our country, capitalized. Attentively, J. Biden. And lastly, the Colombian media basically emphasizing the Caracas statement, saying the rejection. So a few words about the Caracas statement, and I'm going to conclude very soon. So the fundamental points of the Caracas Declaration were following. Stated that France and Mexico intervene in the public affairs of El Salvador, favor, quote unquote, one of the subversive stream that through violence tried to alter the democratic destiny and the free determination of the Salvadorian people. Invited other foreign entities to state their support in favor of the extremist elements that are part of the crisis, try to internationalize the solution to the conflict, and by doing so worsen the conflict. Express basically unconditional support for the junta, which obviously was a provisional elected government, and also for the Salvadoran military, who are largely responsible for the human rights violations. It advocated historically a political and democratic solution to the conflict, but forgot to mention negotiations for free and fair elections. Basically, there are a number of points that we can discuss perhaps in more detail in the Q&A section. Mexico faced diplomatic isolation in Latin America as a result of the declaration. However, the Secretary of Foreign Relations, Castañeda, vigorously defended it and rejected charges of interventionism made by his Latin American peers. Castañeda warned that support for a military solution to the Salvadoran conflict, an oblique reference to US military aid to the junta, will generate more violence and foreign intervention, and lamented the mass killing of civilians perpetrated by state forces in El Salvador. The drafters of the declaration were concerned about the potential US and Salvadoran backlash against the declaration and pondered ways to moderate its content, but in the end decided to support the idea of representative political force, because they believed that was the best way to ensure the creation of a strong counterpart in the negotiation. But they were clearly shocked by the magnitude of the US and Latin American repudiation of the declaration. In his memoir, Castañeda Woodman wrote that the United States, quote unquote, coalesced the entire region against Mexico and practically invoked the Monroe Doctrine to deter what he considered French interventionism in Latin America. In the end, France and Mexico refrained from calling a Security Council meeting on El Salvador and did not promote the international support for the declaration. However, many European governments, political parties, in fact, supported the declaration publicly. It was almost like a European bloc supporting the declaration and Latin American bloc rejecting the declaration. Lastly, ambiguous, calculating an affirmative reaction. The reaction of the head of the junta, Duarte, was fundamentally to criticize Mexico and France, to repeat the same arguments of the Caracas Declaration, but also, interestingly enough, mentioned that he subscribed the idea of creating, quote unquote, mechanisms conducive to dialogue and negotiation necessary for a political solution in the country, but under the legal framework established by the junta and the right-wing parties of El Salvador. Duarte in particular faulted France and Mexico for allegedly defining, quote unquote, at their will, who in this country has legitimacy and political representation. The Reagan administration formulated a scheming reaction to the declaration. This is important. The administration did not openly accuse France and Mexico of intervening in El Salvador, and led its Latin American allies articulated towards opposition to the declaration. Instead, a spokesperson for the State Department formulated a minor reaction to it, considering the level of commitment that the Reagan administration had with the junta. Spokesperson claimed that Mexico had important agreement with the U.S. policy of Chávez. Like the United States, France, and Mexico were also concerned with the suffering of the Salvadoran people, shared the idea of a political solution without outside interference, and obliquely expressed recognition to the FMLN FDR as a political force in El Salvador, but clearly rejected the French-Mexican declaration appeal for a global political solution, or a negotiated political solution to the conflict. Lastly, the insurgent diplomats, the heads of the FMLN FDR diplomacy, the Political Diplomatic Commission also issued a long declaration in which they explain the characteristics of the Salvadoran Civil War, and fundamentally mentioned that the Salvadoran conflict had become a battlefield of the global Cold War. Basically also explained that the US government had taken control of the state, the Salvadoran state, and was in fact a party to the Civil War. They no longer see the US as a standalone actor, but a counterpart in the conflict. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, quote unquote, was, quote unquote, obsessed with finding the roots of the causes of the Salvadoran conflict in Cuba, and dictated formulas to face the crisis. US military advisors participated directly or indirectly in combat operations against the FMLN, and the US government provided more than 600 tons of lethal weapons, quote unquote, to the Salvadoran military. In short, the junta and Salvadoran military were, quote unquote, direct accomplices of US intervention in El Salvador and subservient to the interests of the Salvadoran oligarchy. In this context, the rebel diplomats argued that France and Mexico show a cogent understanding of the characteristics of the Salvadoran conflict and offer a feasible and desirable political and diplomatic solution to it. Legacies. The joint French-Mexican declaration established the fundamental ideas of the conflict resolution model that ended the Civil War in 1992. I can explain this point in detail in the Q&A section. Ironically, the domestic and international adversaries of the Salvadoran insurgency also benefited from the legal implications of the joint French-Mexican declaration. The official recognition of the FMLN FDR as a quote-unquote representative political force by Mexico and France gradually transformed the FMLN into a subject of international humanitarian law applicable to armed internal conflicts. That is to say, Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention and the second protocol additional to the Geneva Convention. Prisoner exchanges, the evacuation of wounded combatants from the battlefield to receive medical attention in El Salvador or abroad, and other measures to humanize the conflict were implemented in the aftermath of the declaration. Against charges of interventionism in El Salvador leveled against Mexico and France by the Latin American countries to subscribe the Caracas Declaration, Castañeda Woodman wrote that, quote unquote, higher principles inspired the authors of the joint declaration. On occasion, those higher principles rebel against, quote unquote, abstract apothegms, sovereignty, and the tradition of each country, quote unquote. Those principles included, quote unquote, the defense of peace in Central America, the defense of the possibility of peaceful social change in El Salvador, and putting an end to the massive human rights violations in the region. One major historical question remains unanswered. Why and how El Salvador Civil War lasted another decade, despite the fact that the joint French-Mexican Declaration offered a viable political and diplomatic solution to the conflict as early as August 1981. Arguably, the Reagan administration's avowed rejection of peace negotiations between the FMLN and FDR, the Salvadoran government, constituted a major factor in the prolongation of the Salvadoran conflict. On the other hand, the internal actors of the conflict either lacked the unanimity or the power base or the will to support peace negotiations in 1981. In 1981, the majority of FMLN leaders still envisioned a victorious democratic revolution, viewed the French-Mexican Declaration as a tactical victory, and were unprepared to engage in definitive peace negotiations. Between 1981 and 1983, a bloody political crisis, in fact, emerged in the top FMLN leadership over the issue of peace negotiations with the Salvadoran government. On the other hand, Duarte's Christian Democrat government, which ruled the country between 1984 and 1989, met with the FMLN FDR on several occasions, but lacked the power base, the will, and the capacity to engage in serious peace negotiations. Lastly, the oligarchic elites, the high-ranking military officers who led the war, and the extremist elements in the right-wing party arena flatly rejected peace negotiations and pursued the destruction of the FMLN, FDR until the end of the conflict. In this milieu, peace was nearly impossible, and thus the Civil War devastated El Salvador for another decade. But this is a matter of another conversation. Conclusion. This lecture has alluded to the Atlantic dimensions of the Cold War in Latin America. We suggest that the multiple negotiations and alliances made between political parties, governments, non-state and subaltern actors across the Atlantic during the Cold War remain largely unexamined. This episode also illustrates the roles that diplomats, public intellectuals, and experts in international relations play in promoting peace during the Cold War in Latin America. In August 1981, France and Mexico, with the help of multiple actors and experts across the Atlantic, set the conceptual basis for the UN-mediated negotiations that ended the Salvadoran conflict in January 1992. The joint French-Mexican Declaration on El Salvador indeed constituted avant-garde diplomacy at the time of the 1980s Cold War in Latin America. Thank you.
Joaquín, super interesting. I have several questions, but I have one that's really like something I can understand. Can you explain a little the position of Venezuela in this? Yeah. Why did they take this antagonistic position? And another question has to do with actually whether the French-Mexican diplomacy actually consulted with other Latin American nations, including Venezuela, and if they invited basically or opened any talks with the Salvadoran government.
The two questions. The first is Herrera Campins, the leader of COPEI in Venezuela, the president of Venezuela, was a close ally. The Christian Democrat leader, Jose Napoleon Duarte, was the head of the Salvadoran Junta and the Christian Democrats in general. So that was a big factor in the decision. Another element is something that we discussed in different sources, different ways. Some sources claim that in fact Herrera Campins acted on behalf of Reagan. Basically, Reagan made a specific request for Herrera Campins to actually coalesce the Latin American governments against the declaration. That I have not been able to corroborate, but it's one of the explanation. So for me, as of now, it's more about his loyalty, right, to a fellow Christian Democrat in El Salvador, and basically was also the position of the Christian Democracy International from the.
And did the Italians actually take the same stance, or did
Yeah,
they?
they the same.
But you said that they supported basically the French Declaration, or not? Or
Was-
you said basically that European powers basically supported the Franco-Mexican
Was
Declaration.
actually the social democratic government.
Yeah. So Italy took a different.
Italy, yeah, they
Yeah.
did to understand that. But for in general, I think the Christian Democrat governments and parties right, supported Duarte, and basically the Guerra campaign was part of that.
Yeah.
That same group. On the other hand, about the second question, being able to read sources in the Mexican diplomatic archives that indicated that Castañeda tried to build bridges with the Venezuelan counterparts prior to the declaration. On multiple occasions, he tried to meet with the head of the Venezuelan diplomacy in Zambrana, right? At the time, anyhow, it's a lot of detail, but the fact is that he tried. The bridges that apparently that didn't work. So in the end, I think it was mostly about the commitment that those two specific governments had on the situation, and also interestingly enough, as you know, clearly in the aftermath of these events, Mexico and Venezuela worked together, right? Part of the Contadora group.
Yes.
The regional initiative. Peace in Central America, but this is prior to Contadora.
No, go ahead.
Great talk, really interesting stuff. I have two sort of big questions that maybe you could riff on. The first is, when you were going over the 7 points of the declaration, it seemed like a huge component of this was making the Civil War less an ideological battle and more of a political battle.
Right.
And it's more difficult to solve ideological problems than it is to solve political problems. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the strategy, if this is where this idea came from, or if it's new, or how much, or am I misreading it? So that was one, sort of ideological versus political. And then the second question has to do with sort of a larger think about the Cold War. And it seems like part of what you're trying to do here is give significant agency to force us to rethink the Cold War, which is, more traditionally told as a titanic battle between two states, the United States and the Soviet Union. And here we've got powers that are operating on their own or outside the confines that are the parameters that are set in place, which forces us to think about how we tell the grand narrative. So I wonder if you could riff on that as well.
Yeah. So the first question, I think this was a process that probably started with the International Socialist Declarations on El Salvador in 1980. In other words, the fundamental idea of, let me say, a global political solution was already there in previous declarations by the members of the Socialist International, even particularly some other particular local actors. But what is important here is that they were able to explain in detail what the global political solution meant. The FMLN, FDR as a counterpart, direct negotiations, the stuff of the political reform, the regime, the military reform, all these ideas were basically what the authors of the declaration basically added, but I think it was part of this multiple dialogue that I was trying to reference in the conclusion section, where there's a multiple from dialogue between these governments, political parties, the FMLN and the FDR, right? So it's a combination. All of these actors that made those ideas possible. So that's I guess my point about the critical mass, which I'm trying to allude to the critical mass, and the critical mass in this case is obviously right, the French and the Mexican diplomats, the FMLN people were involved, the experts, diplomatic experts, and obviously the political figures or others who were part of it. In terms of the question, I think that I think is the main, is the historically speaking, right? It's probably the main takeaway from this story. Fundamentally, when one think about the evolution of the historiography, usually it's no longer about only the global confrontation between the two opposed superpowers. Right? We have now the perspective of the global Cold War, cultural understandings of the Cold War, subaltern, et cetera, et cetera. But this is different. We're talking about an Atlantic narrative of the Cold War that is not clear at all. I think we're very, or perhaps in a very limited way. To my mind comes the work of someone like Martin Klinker, for instance, who writes about the relationship between the activists of the German Social Democratic Party and Students for Democratic Society in the US, making this bridge between story. This, I think, is very limited. We're talking about a larger set of actors that operate in multiple ways throughout the 1980s Cold War. Not only in this case, I mean, there's a parallel process that is taking place at this time, which is the North-South dialogue. So the big picture for France and Mexico was the North-South dialogue. They were organizing this major initiative in Cancun, right? Another 22 countries, right? To conduct what they believe will be an historical dialogue between the powerful countries of the North and countries, third world countries, and they believe that this historical dialogue will bring about solutions to a number of political, economic issues, development issues, and so on. So this is the big conversation, and the stuff on El Salvador is very particular, but it's part of the same thing. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. So I wanted to ask you to remind us again, the Latin American countries that opposed the statement besides Venezuela. And then secondly, I'm wondering, I don't know enough about Mexico's political and economic context in this period, but I'm wondering why Mexico would risk alienating the United States, by basically undermining or going against their policy towards Central America at this time. When I mean, this is clearly long before discussion. I'm assuming long before discussions over NAFTA.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure. I don't think this was a key moment in immigration.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for the question. For what I know, in the history of Mexican diplomacy, this is a very special period, in the sense that they were, as you were saying, they were able to, or willing to risk a lot in their bilateral relations with the US, but also they were conscious of the Lopez Portillo, all these big figures in Mexican politics were extremely conscious of the seriousness of the situation in Central America and how that will affect Mexico strategically. So it's a big concern. But also there are other elements that allow them to pursue a policy like referring in passing the oil boom of the 78, and they feel they have resources. In fact, they are providing important, massive economic resources to Nicaragua this time. So these are very specific conditions, I would say, or exceptional conditions, perhaps, that enable this initiative. In the countries that subscribed the initiative were Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Guatemala, Honduras, and Bolivia. In addition, Venezuela, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic. We have to make a distinction between the right-wing anti-communist dictatorships, right? Mostly from the southern cone, and then other countries have, for very specific reasons, Venezuela and Colombia, right? Specific reasons to subscribe the declaration. But in fact, virtually all of the Latin American countries actually stated their own position on the issue. Brazil did, Peru, Ecuador, Costa Rica. Some of them were mildly critical to the declaration, but they didn't reject the declaration. They were sort of like an intermediate position. Right? So that's why the reference to Cold War politics, because no one was silent about this stuff, basically. They all understood the serious diplomatic implications of the declaration, and all of them took their own stance.
Okay. So, I need to ask whether we can help. So of course, 1981, right, is the huge seismic shift in France. Is El Salvador the only place where Mitterrand is doing this kind of thing? Is he also engaging? He's part of the North-South?
Yeah. I mean, with this level of risk,
Right,
yeah, it's the only place. I think.
Okay.
Eventually, they sort of retreat a little bit afterwards
okay,
because they still are interested in follow the event and conflict and do take initiatives, humanitarian initiatives mainly. They took wounded combatants, for Mexican medical treatment in France, things like that they did, but they never actually engaged more frontally after 1981. And again, for Mitterrand was his credentials in Latin America, and also he was one of the main leaders of the North-South initiative, right? There is also a major event between Lopez Portillo and Mitterrand in Mexico City. Mass event, I would say, where the PRI actually displayed some political machinery, right, to receive Mitterrand in Mexico City, right, where he conveyed some ideas on Latin America and the North-South dialogue.
Megan, my other question is, like, you mentioned that part of it rested on the idea of the FMLN as representative, right? Does that involve a new theory of political representation, or is it returning to a more pure, I find that.
Yeah,
really
it's
interesting.
a very unique part of the idea of the avant-garde diplomacy is that basically they didn't want to replicate passé diplomatic concepts of the 19th century, like state of belligerency or things like that. Because for France, it had implications for the France's relation with the anti-colonial movements in Africa. So they didn't want to set a precedent for that.
Wow.
And for Mexico, the big debate was the issue of intervention. In fact, a lot of the scholarship, Mexican diplomatic history, the main concern is always revolves around the accusations of interventionism against Mexico. Right? So, to what extent statute of belligerency will basically undermine Mexico's position in non-intervention? These were more of the reasons why we did that.
Oh, go ahead. Thank you so much. I really like this book and news that there's something forthcoming, as you say. I was curious if you knew of any indication that this kind of like diplomacy influenced the way the FMLN saw themselves. It stood out to me that they're with exceptions, but like known for their like humane prisoner exchange and even like, I don't know the ins and outs, but their efforts to initiate peace process, like in Chalatenango and stuff. I'm curious, it never occurred to me that actually this kind of diplomacy could almost give them a framework for like how they saw themselves or conducted themselves.
No, totally. It was a watershed in political and diplomatic history. I was referring precisely to this kind of transformation, where they acknowledged that there were basically counterparts in an armed conflict with legal implications, and also the fact that sooner or later there will be a direct negotiation with the Salvadoran government. And I think in general, I think the fact that they have access to the highest levels of government in Europe, basically unconditional access, allow them to see the world in a very, very different terms, non-ideological terms. Most of the FMLN leaders were Marxists or Marxist-Leninists, and so for them to be able to meet social democratic leaders from Western Europe, right, and to be treated with respect, with consideration, but also to show that the social democracy, in fact, understood the nature of the conflict very well and was willing to play a positive solution, was extremely transformative. I actually have a big argument about that in my book. In fact, I believe that is the beginning of the political and ideological transformation of the FMLN. Those interactions between FMLN leaders and social democratic leaders enabled the FMLN to transition from a Marxist-Leninist movement into a socialist democratic movement, right, in the span of a few years. So it's a very important point. Thank you.
I think there was another question before me.
Jeff, you wanna?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Joaquín. This is a really fascinating talk and extremely provocative. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how the by then 10, 12-year-old declaration shapes the character of the piece that's established in the early 90s, and how critical the French-Mexican intervention and the domino effects of French-Mexican intervention really proved to be much later in the early 90s to the character of that piece, and that's established in it. Behind it, I'm wondering historiographically if there are alternative ways that scholars have understood the outcome of the conflict, and you're offering one that is in some ways top down. It seems an external explanation that the peace is the result of Atlantic diplomacy, as opposed to an explanation, let's say, more on the ground, more grassroots. So I'm wondering if you can kind of fill that in.
Very crucial question. Thank you. For the first one, I have this that I offer a comparison between the two documents. The fundamental idea, recognition of the representative political force and counterpart negotiation, was reflected in the UN negotiation. The global political solution that involved in sectors of Salvadoran society was reflected in the participation of political parties, civil society organizations in multiple ways. The new internal regime basically entails the content of the peace accord: constitutional reform, political reform, judicial reform, electoral reform. Altogether, they created a new political regime. The structure of the armed forces entails many technicalities, but basically was a comprehensive security reform that involved military reform, public security reform, intelligence reform, and all together. And also how to preserve the popular will to re-election. Basically, the comprehensive reform of the electoral system was implemented, and now El Salvador has one of the best electoral systems in Latin America, I would like to say. And lastly, the role of the international community was reflected in all of these figures. The UN mediation was a particular type of activist diplomacy, came out in the last period of the negotiation. It was called the group of friends that involved all of those countries: Mexico, Spain, Venezuela, and Colombia. And even the US, eventually in the last stages of the process, the group of friends plus one. The plus one was the United States as a political actor, diplomatic actor. Not the UN mission itself. So all that, just to make the point that it's absolutely clear, right, that the fundamental ideas of the French-Mexican Declaration inspired, right, the peace. The second question was about the historiography. Yeah, there is mainly, I think, at this point, there is historiography and the diplomatic history of Mexico that is pertinent to the story, where Mexican historians have considered some of the implications, right, for the declaration for Mexico in particular. But I believe that historiographically, the story I'm telling is basically this presentation is just one element of the entire book. Right? So in other words, as you were saying, this is the top down, right? But fundamentally, the several other chapters of the book basically really show that this is democracy from below. Right? Basically, what made possible the political process that eventually unfolded was motivated by political mobilization. This is an argument that has already been advanced by political scientists like Elizabeth Wood, for instance. She wrote an entire book on, like, basically the peace process as an expression of popular democracy, right? So I think it is a very credible and important argument that try to probably engage in the book and expand a little bit. Yeah, but I'm trying to deal with combinations of factors. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah,
As someone wants to
okay.
go.
Let's see, Anna and Claire, yeah.
I think first,
No, but
excuse me, I've lost my voice because allergies. Thank you very much for the presentation. My class ended a little too late for me to hear the beginning of it, but I've looked at a similar situation in Africa. And so I was interested in if you could expand a little bit more on how you relate France Afrique, for example, which involved a long-term policy which Mitterrand completely continued, and other French presidents of putting in and maintaining dictators in the former colonies of France, as well as others like former Belgian colonies like Rwanda, which led to the Rwandan genocide in the end, which was also a single party system, not competing parties. And how does that, how can you rationalize the French intervention in this case with that very distinct policy? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I've been alerted in the past about the apparent incongruences with the foreign policy, but this is something that, as far as the actors of the story, like this story, that they were desperate to find a political solution to a conflict and to stop the massive loss of life that's taking place and the escalation of the conflict. Probably, for what I have read, it's not that they were oblivious or ignorant that part of the story, but simply they have to take a pragmatic attitude vis-a-vis two very important countries, right, that were willing to risk many things. Diplomatic, right? So in the case of Mexico, I've been told other things like about Mexico too, but we're talking about a very specific chapter of diplomatic history that pertains one very specific country, right? And one of the most intense hotspots, right, of the global Cold War in the 80s. So I guess in the end, it was all about that. Basically.
Yes.
So thank you.
So did any of the anyone in the African countries look at the declaration and say, hey, we want that? Or
I know there's another part of the story I'm writing. So basically, the insurgent diplomacy of the FMLN, and they have representatives in Africa, and they were most African anti-colonial leaders or revolutionary leaders were totally okay with it. They understood it was a pragmatic decision and a very specific circumstance. We never received particular, as far as I know, so yeah, it's part of the particularity of this process.
Claire, and then
Thanks so much. I guess I have two questions, and the first one's kind of building up a little bit on what others have faced. I was kind of curious about sort of what's happening in the Pacific side. In the Pacific, right? In like Vietnam, what their responses are. And I was thinking that partially because your emphasis on Atlantic connections, it strikes me that's a geopolitical relation that itself was adopted by your actors. And so I guess historiographically speaking, I'm curious how much you want to follow through with that. Partially I'm thinking in the sense of how scholars have also adopted that analytic of the global South as a way of thinking through these different relations. So I'd just be kind of curious to hear how you might be thinking with that.
Thank you for the question. There are some enough, I think, historiographical or historical grounds to pursue this story, because in the end, all of these social democratic actors from Europe, right, in one way or the other, were involved in the entire process from beginning to end, literally until the signing of the peace accords and even after that, in different degrees. Right? So in that sense, they were very important political actors in the entire story, and virtually nothing is written about that agency, at least in the historiography in the Cold War. And the question about the Atlantic connection is something that is also structural, right, for Central America. It's basically the connections between the Central American region, not only with the United States, but also with many Western European countries are historically very, very grounded. So this is a chapter in that, another chapter in that story, right? As far as the Pacific, there are several actors who have some resonance here. For instance, in the case of Vietnam, especially at the beginning of the conflict, right? Vietnam had very strong connections with some of the FMLN groups, but not necessarily, mostly political and ideological connections, but not necessarily, let's say, active participation or diplomatic participation, right? So it's a kind of a faraway story, but it's there because several actors are close, right, to experience of Vietnam, or feel close ideologically or politically to Vietnam. So in that sense, it's part of the story, but not necessarily as Vietnam as a big actor in the conflict. In China, it's a much more distant actor, although several groups in the 80s sort of courted China, but China never played an active role in the conflict and such. So I guess the decision to pursue this analytical framework, right, has to do with the historical events within the structural connections between the two regions.
I just want to say, I really enjoyed your talk. I think it was very insightful. I really liked especially how you brought up like Mitterrand's sort of weird position being a socialist president of an imperialist country. And I'm really glad that, you know, Africa was brought up, especially like with regards to like French actions in the Algerian Civil War. But I also wanted to ask you, so France sort of like going against the United States a little bit, going against the, you know, the grain of NATO, so to speak. So like, I mean, given like the sort of prevalent sort of Euroscepticism in recent years, especially among like American conservatives, like where do you put like this sort of incident in that story? Like, do we see like the beginning of like American sort of like annoyance, let's say, with European countries, or is this sort of like a trend that started before, and this is just like one instance of that?
I think the specific case of the Salvadoran conflict, in general, the Central American conflicts, the Europeans and the Americans never actually agreed on this policy up until the moment when the Americans did support it after the Malta meeting between Gorbachev and Bush. Basically, there is an agreement to continue with the negotiation. At that moment in time, the US becomes another productive and positive actor, right, in the political solution to it. But this is very late in the story, about 1991. Right? So basically, during most of the conflict, right, both blocs are very or apparently opposite positions regarding the conflict. And I think the Western European position is very unique, even in relation to the Soviet position, because in the end, curiously, even the Salvadorian communist leaders were the closest to the Soviet Union, became extremely critical of the Soviet Union, basically saying, you know, we don't want to do business with you politically, because basically you are more or less aligned with the Reagan policy in Central America. And in fact, some of them said, it's amazing how the social democratic parties from Western Europe have been much more serious and consistent, right, in their position vis-a-vis the conflict than the Soviet leadership. This is happening. So it's a very, very, I would say, very peculiar, very special, and very interesting, I think, interesting position historically. It speaks to, I think, to a previous question of our understandings of the Cold War is not, I think that framework of two blocks, solid blocks, and confronted with each other is no longer tenable historically or historiographically. I mean, the situation is much more fluid and complex, right? And this story sort of illustrates, I think, that analytical perspective.
Joaquín, I think something that might buttress the argument you're making in the sense of saying that this was avant-garde diplomacy is the fact that it precedes probably the moment in which the tank really triggers around 84, 85. So they were, before that period, this was a very bold type of diplomacy. And I think probably the fact that you saw so much pushback is because the context didn't allow. I'm not convinced that the argument has to do so much with the notion of belligerence, that we can talk about that later. In the sense that and that's something probably I would be curious. You were saying that after the declaration, actually the parties in El Salvador actually activated Common Article 3, that in a way takes into consideration that, you know, the FMLN was really a belligerent group, and then IHL sort of kicks in and parties start recognizing each other as belligerent, even though that was not. Governments oftentimes reject the notion because they don't want to confer legitimacy to rebel groups, but in reality on the ground, it was operating as such.
Sure.
So I think that probably the avant-garde part has to do with the boldness rather than with the language of international humanitarian law.
Yeah, I mean, I think the avant-garde is basically how they were able to formulate a comprehensive model for a comprehensive political solution to a conflict that roughly had a year and a half in the making. But they foresaw, right, the possibility that this conflict will escalate dramatically as in fact it happened, and envision, right, really nuanced model, right, to solve the conflict at the very beginning of the conflict. And that's why it's avant-garde, because nobody at that moment in time, 1981, eventually, right, in the late 80s, many other actors are talking about more or less the same ideas or even other ideas. But the very fundamental model was there. So the fundamental idea, those 7 ideas are the fundamental ideas of the peace accord. That's why it's avant-garde, because nobody else envisioned that at the time. Or perhaps they envisioned that we're not willing to take the political and economic responsibility, endorsing that vision.